I trusted him completely, and this is how he repays me. It's just too much to bear.
The air in that sterile, glass-walled office was so cold it felt like a tomb. And my daughter-in-law, Amelia, looked at me as if I were a ghost already haunting it. The closing attorney, a man with a smile as thin as a paper cut, slid a mountain of documents across the polished mahogany table toward my son, Mark. And here we have the final deed for the $64 million estate, he announced, his voice slick with false reverence. Mark signed with a flourish of his gold pen. Then Amelia took her turn, her manicured nails tapping impatiently. I leaned forward, my old heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs, expecting the pen to be passed to me next. After all, it was the entire inheritance from my late husband, my life savings of over $230,000 from the sale of my home, that made this grand purchase possible. But Amelia simply pushed the papers back toward the lawyer. She turned to me, her eyes as vacant as a winter sky, and said, "You don't need to sign, Ilara. You're not on the deed. You see, my dear, a heart doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks, slowly, over time, like the fine porcelain of my favorite chipped mug, the one I'd drunk my morning tea from for 47 years. That mug, with its faded bluebells, had been a wedding gift from my Arthur. He was a good man, a man whose hands were calloused from work, but whose touch was always gentle. We didn't have much, but our small home in the Oregon countryside was filled with a warmth that money can't buy. It smelled of baking bread, of the lavender I grew by the window, and of the old wood that creaked and groaned like a contented old friend. In that house, I raised my only child, my Catherine. Oh, how I loved that girl. I saw the world in her eyes. When she was little and dreamed of becoming a doctor, I started a mason jar. Every spare nickel, every dime I saved from the grocery budget went into that jar. It was my silent promise to her, a testament to a mother's boundless hope. Over the years, that jar filled and emptied a dozen times, paying for textbooks, for tuition, for the dream that finally saw her in a crisp white coat. My Arthur passed on a cold November morning, leaving a silence in the house that no amount of noise could ever fill. He also left me with our home, paid in full, and a small but sturdy pension. On our last anniversary, he'd given me a string of pearls. They weren't grand, but they were real, and when he fastened them around my neck, he whispered, "For my queen. A woman of your dignity deserves nothing less." I treasured them. They were my armor, a reminder of a love that was pure and true. In his old cedar chest, locked with a small brass key, he left me his letters. Decades of correspondence, his thoughts, his heart, all tied in a faded blue ribbon. He told me to keep them safe, that they held the story of our life. That chest became my most sacred possession. Catherine married Mark a few years after her father's passing. Mark was ambitious. He moved through the world with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his suits always perfectly tailored, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He was a real estate developer who turned dust into gold, and soon my daughter was living in a world I only recognized from magazines. Their home was a palace of marble and glass, a place where footsteps echoed and voices felt small. It was a cold house, a house without the scent of baking bread. After a while, they began to visit me less. The phone calls grew shorter. When they did come, their eyes would scan my humble home with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Mother," Catherine would say, her voice strained, "this place is falling apart. The upkeep must be a nightmare for you." Then, on April 3rd, 2 days before their annual spring gala, they sat me down in my own worn armchair. "We have a wonderful idea," Mark began, his voice dripping with a practiced sincerity that set my teeth on edge. "We're buying a new property, a magnificent estate on the coast. Acres of land, a house big enough for a whole army, and we want you to come live with us." Catherine placed her hand on mine. Her skin was soft, but her touch felt distant. "There's a beautiful in-law suite, Mama. Your own little apartment. We can take care of you. No more worrying about leaky roofs or property taxes." They painted a beautiful picture, a golden cage for my twilight years. The price, they explained, was steep, but my little house, sitting on a now valuable piece of land, could cover the down payment. We would pool our resources, they said. We would be a family, all under one roof. All I had to do was sign the deed of my home over to them so they could sell it. I never expected what I found in that drawer. My heart, foolish and full of a mother's unending love, wanted to believe them. I saw the logic. I was getting older, and the house was a lot to manage. The thought of being with my daughter, of seeing my grandchildren every day, was a powerful lure, so I agreed. I signed the quitclaim deed on a Tuesday, my hand trembling as I surrendered the only home I had ever known. The sale was quick. Mark handled everything. He told me they got a good price, about $230,000, and that every penny of it was going directly toward our new future. The day the moving truck came was one of the hardest of my life. The movers, hired by Mark, were rough and careless. They packed my life into brown boxes with a brutal efficiency. My chipped mug was wrapped callously in a newspaper and tossed into a box labeled kitchen junk. My cedar chest with Arthur's letters was deemed too old-fashioned. "We'll get you new furniture, Ilara," Amelia, Mark's sister who had come to supervise, had chirped, dismissing the chest with a wave of her hand. "Something that matches the new aesthetic." I had to fight to keep it, insisting it come with me. A strange coldness began to seep into my bones, a premonition I couldn't quite name. The day we went to the closing for the new mansion was the day the cracks in my heart began to split wide open. That was the day Amelia uttered those fateful words, "You're not on the deed." I stared at her, then at Catherine, searching for some flicker of protest, some sign of a mistake. But my daughter wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the gleaming mahogany table, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. Mark cleared his throat. "It's a legal technicality, Ilara," he said smoothly. "For tax purposes, it's cleaner this way. But of course you'll live there. The suite is yours. This changes nothing." But everything had changed. The air I was breathing had changed. I was no longer a partner in this new life. I was a tenant, a guest in a house bought with my own history, my own security. I felt the weight of Arthur's pearls around my neck, and for the first time, they felt less like armor and more like a leash. A profound and terrible truth began to dawn. In the grand theater of life, some betrayals are not born of hatred, but of a chilling and absolute indifference. The drive to the new estate was silent. I sat in the back of their cavernous luxury car, the smell of new leather choking me, and watched the Oregon pines blur past the tinted windows. The mansion was even more imposing up close, a monument of cold stone and sharp angles that seemed to scorn the wild, natural beauty surrounding it. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a corporate headquarters. A maid I had never met opened the door and took my single worn coat without a word. Mark and Catherine swept inside, their voices echoing in the cathedral-like foyer as they discussed where to hang a monstrous piece of modern art. No one showed me to my room. I was left standing in the entryway, a piece of old furniture they hadn't yet decided where to place. After a few minutes, a young woman in a uniform approached me. "You must be Mrs. Gable," she said politely. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson asked me to show you to your quarters." Quarters. The word hung in the air, clinical and cold. It was the word one used for servants. She was hiding something. I could feel it in her hesitation. She led me not to the main house, but through a side door, down a covered breezeway, and to a small building that stood apart from the main residence. It was what they might have called a guest house, but it had the distinct feeling of an afterthought. The room was small, barely furnished with a simple bed, a dresser, and a small table. The air was damp and smelled of fresh paint and plaster dust. There was no kitchen, only a microwave and a small refrigerator buzzing sadly in the corner. This was not the beautiful in-law suite they had promised. This was not the heart of the family. This was exile. "The bathroom is just through there," the maid said, gesturing to a door. "If you need anything, you can use the intercom to call the main house." She left, closing the door with a soft, final click. I stood in the center of the room, my suitcase on the floor beside me. The silence was absolute. I was on an island, separated from my family by a chasm of cold stone and colder intentions. I walked to the window and looked out at the main house. The lights were blazing, and through the enormous glass walls, I could see them moving about, laughing, living a life that I had paid for but was not invited to join. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass, a small old woman. made insignificant by the scale of their ambition. Later that evening, a different maid brought a tray with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. The soup was lukewarm. I couldn't eat. My stomach was a tight knot of grief and disbelief. I unpacked my few belongings. I placed my chipped mug on the small table, a defiant splash of familiar comfort in this alien space. I set the locked cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I wanted to open it, to read Arthur's letters and hear his voice in my head, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like admitting defeat, like running to a ghost for comfort because the living had so thoroughly abandoned me. The hours ticked by. Sometime after midnight, unable to sleep, I felt a desperate need for a glass of water that didn't taste of plastic from the cheap pitcher they'd left me. I slipped on my robe and slippers and made my way across the stone breezeway to the main house. The door was unlocked. The house was dark and silent, except for a sliver of light coming from under the door of Mark's study. I crept closer, drawn by an instinct I didn't understand. I only meant to slip into the kitchen unnoticed, but then I heard Mark's voice, low and smug. He was on the phone, and the words I heard next turned the cold dread in my veins to ice. "No, the transfer is complete," he was saying, a satisfied chuckle in his tone. The old house sold, and the funds went directly into the primary acquisition account. She signed the quitclaim, no questions asked. There was a pause. I pressed my ear closer to the door, my breath catching in my throat. Her personal savings? Oh, that was even easier. She signed a durable power of attorney last month. Thought it was for her health and well-being. The accounts are already being consolidated under our trust. He laughed again, a sound devoid of all warmth. "Don't worry about the will. The old one won't be a problem. We have a new one drafted, much cleaner. Catherine will handle her signature when the time is right. As for Alara, she's comfortable in the guest house. Out of sight, out of mind. Honestly, she's practically a ghost already. No one will question a thing when the time comes." I did not scream. I did not cry. A strange and terrible calm washed over me as I backed away from that study door, each step a silent, measured retreat from the life I once knew. The person who had crept across the cold stone breezeway in search of a glass of water was gone forever. In her place stood a woman I did not recognize, a sentinel carved from ice and fury. Back in my room, my cell, I sat on the edge of the bed, the thin mattress groaning under my weight, and I let his words replay in my mind. Practically a ghost already. No one will question a thing. It was not a betrayal born of a moment's anger, you see. It was a meticulously crafted damnation, a plot to erase me from my own life, to render me so insignificant that my eventual disappearance would be seen as a mercy, not a crime. My daughter, my Catherine, was a willing party to this spiritual execution. The thought was a physical blow, a pain so profound it left no room for tears. In that moment, I understood a truth that chills me to this day. The cruelest prisons are not made of iron bars, but of the love you still feel for your jailers. From that night forward, I began my own performance. The world had cast me as a frail, confused old woman, and I would play the part with the skill of a seasoned actress. When Catherine or Mark visited my little room, I would feign a gentle confusion, my eyes distant, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my tea. I would forget names, ask the same question twice, and allow a vacant smile to be my shield. They lapped it up. Their relief was palpable. They saw a mind already fading, a problem that was conveniently solving itself. Their visits became acts of condescending charity. Catherine would bring me a shawl, her touch as brief and sterile as a nurse's. "Are you warm enough, Mama?" she would ask, her eyes already looking past me toward the door. Mark would pat my hand and speak to me in the loud, slow voice one reserves for a difficult child. "Now, Alara, you just rest. We'll handle everything." Oh, they were handling everything indeed. They were dismantling my life piece by piece, right before my veiled, watchful eyes. And I saw something else that gave them away. A young woman named Carol was hired, a private nurse who was to check on me twice a day. She arrived with a bright, professional smile and a bag full of blood pressure cuffs and thermometers. "Just to make sure you're getting the best of care," Amelia announced, her voice ringing with a falseness that was almost comical. But I saw the way Carol's eyes darted around my small room, cataloging my few possessions, noting the book on my nightstand, the way I moved. She wasn't a caregiver. She was a warden. Her questions were casual but sharp as needles. "Do you remember what you had for breakfast, Alara? Did you have any interesting dreams?" She was assessing me, gauging my lucidity for her true employers. I gave her nothing. I spoke of the weather, of the birds outside my window, of memories from a distant, harmless past. I became a creature of pleasantries and placid smiles, a ghost haunting the edges of their gilded life, all while the fire of vengeance was being stoked in the furnace of my soul. One afternoon, Amelia came to my room. She held my chipped mug in her hands, the one with the faded bluebells that Arthur had given me. "Oh, Alara, this old thing is so stained and cracked," she said with a dismissive laugh. "Let me get you a new one from the house. Something cheerful." Before I could protest, her grip seemed to slip. The mug fell to the stone floor and shattered into 100 pieces. An accident, of course. Her apology was a masterpiece of insincere regret. Oh, clumsy me. I am so sorry. But I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes. It was not enough to exile me. They had to break the last vestiges of my old life, to erase every symbol of the woman I had been. I knelt, my old joints protesting, and gathered the broken shards into my palm. I did not weep. I simply looked at her and said in my most frail voice, "It's all right, my dear. It was just an old mug." But in my heart, I made a silent vow. Each of these cruelties, large and small, was a debt, and I would one day be the collector. They thought they were strong, but they were about to learn my name. The matter of the pearls was the next turn of the screw. Catherine had borrowed them weeks ago for the gala, the day they had convinced me to sell my home. When I finally worked up the courage to ask for them back, feigning a sentimental desire to wear them, her face clouded over. "Oh, Mama," she sighed, a mask of frustration settling over her features. "I'm so sorry. With the move and everything, I think they've been misplaced. I've looked everywhere." She wouldn't meet my eyes. My pearls weren't lost. They were stolen. My dignity, the last gift from my husband, was now just another one of their assets, likely sitting in a velvet box in her climate-controlled closet. It was a calculated stripping of my identity. First my home, then my money, then my memories, and now my honor. It is a terrifying thing to realize that your own child views your entire existence as little more than a collection of assets to be liquidated. I began to realize that their plan was not just to take my money, but to unmake me entirely. My days took on a new rhythm. I was a prisoner studying the habits of my guards. I learned the staff's schedules, the precise minute the landscapers arrived, the time Mark left for his office, and the time he returned. From my window, I watched them. I saw the endless stream of deliveries, cases of wine, designer clothing, expensive art. They were spending my legacy, the fruits of a lifetime of my and Arthur's hard work, on trivialities. One afternoon, while the house was empty, I slipped across the breezeway. The cold air felt electric on my skin. I needed to find Arthur's original will, the one that named me the sole beneficiary of his estate. The document that would prove their new forged will was a fraud. My heart pounded as I entered the silent mansion. It felt like a violation, trespassing in a life that should have been my own. I went straight to the living room, to the corner where they had begrudgingly placed my cedar chest. I knelt and reached for the small brass key I kept on a chain around my neck. But I didn't need it. The lock was already broken, the wood around it splintered. They had forced it open. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, Arthur's letters were still there, their blue ribbon undisturbed. But the long, thick envelope that held his last will and testament was gone. A cold wave of despair washed over me. They had been so thorough. They had thought of everything. I was truly, utterly alone, with no proof and no allies. I retreated to my room, the stolen will a phantom limb I could still feel the absence of. I sat with Arthur's letters in my lap, their familiar weight a small comfort in the crushing emptiness. I had hit a wall. They held all the cards, the money, the lawyers, the power of attorney, and now, my husband's true will. I was a ghost, just as Mark had said, with no legal standing, no voice, no power. Despair is a patient predator, my dear. It circles, it waits, and when you are at your weakest, it moves in for the kill. I felt its teeth at my throat. For 2 days, I merely existed. I ate what they brought me. I answered Carol the nurse's questions with monosyllables. I watched the sun rise and set without hope. Was this my end? To fade away in this gilded cage, a footnote in the story of my daughter's spectacular wealth? I almost surrendered. I almost let the cold tide pull me under. Then, on the third day, the announcement came. Mark and Catherine were hosting their 10th anniversary party, a grand affair with over 200 guests. Amelia delivered the news to me, her voice sickeningly sweet. It's going to be a huge party, Alara. The governor might even stop by. We'll have a plate sent over to you, of course. It will be far too loud and confusing for you in the main house. I was not a guest. I was a liability to be hidden away. And in that moment of ultimate dismissal, something inside me did not break. It hardened. It turned from ice to diamond. They were going to celebrate their success, a success built on my ruin. And I decided, with a clarity that felt like a divine command, that their celebration would be the beginning of their downfall. I now knew I had to act. A new plan began to form, a desperate, audacious gamble. The next day, I feigned a small dizzy spell while Carol was with me. "Oh, my dear," I murmured, pressing a hand to my forehead. "I think my blood pressure is acting up. And I've run out of my aspirin." I knew she would report this to Mark. It was the perfect excuse. I needed to go into town, to the pharmacy. Carol insisted on driving me. This was my chance. While she was inside paying for the medication, I told her I needed a moment of fresh air. I walked a few doors down to a small electronics shop. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt like a spy in a foreign land. Inside, I found what I was looking for, a tiny digital voice recorder no bigger than my thumb. It cost $23, paid for with the last of the cash I had tucked away in my purse. It was a pittance, a laughable weapon against their millions, but it was all I had. I hid it in the pocket of my coat, my secret weapon. The day of the party arrived. The grounds of the estate were transformed. Valets were parking gleaming cars, caterers were bustling about, and the sound of a string quartet drifted on the evening air. My room felt 1,000 miles away from the festivities. A maid brought my dinner on a tray, a dry piece of salmon and some asparagus. I watched her leave, then I locked my door. I put on my best dress, a simple navy blue one, and around my neck, in place of my stolen pearls, I fastened the chain with the key to my now empty cedar chest. It would have to be my armor tonight. When darkness fell, I waited. I watched the shadows lengthen, my ear tuned to the rhythms of the party. I knew Mark often took important guests into his study for a private drink, to talk business away from the crowd. His arrogance would be his undoing. He would never imagine that the frail old woman in the guest house was a threat. Around 10 o'clock, when the party was at its peak, I slipped out of my room. I moved through the shadows of the garden, a ghost in my own right, my heart a frantic drum against the silence. I crept to the side of the house, to the window of Mark's study. The curtains were partially drawn. I saw him inside, laughing with 2 other men, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. I waited. Half an hour later, they left, rejoining the party. This was my moment. I scurried to the back door that led to the kitchen. As I'd hoped, it was propped open for the catering staff. I slipped inside, my body trembling with adrenaline. The noise from the main hall was a dull roar. I moved down the hallway, my soft slippers making no sound on the marble floor. The study door was ajar. I pushed it open, slipped inside, and closed it behind me. The room smelled of leather and hubris. I quickly found a spot for the recorder, tucking it behind a thick legal book on the bottom shelf of his grand mahogany bookshelf. It had a clear line of sight to his desk and the leather chairs where he and his guests sat. I switched it on. The tiny red light blinked once, then went dark. It was active. Getting out was even more terrifying, but I made it, my heart feeling as though it would burst from my chest. Back in my room, I waited. The hours crawled by. The music finally faded. The last of the cars crunched down the gravel driveway, and the house fell silent. Now came the hardest part. Around 2 a.m, I made the journey one last time. I retrieved the recorder, my fingers shaking as I slipped it back into my pocket. Back in my cell, I plugged the small device into the cheap clock radio I'd found in the closet, using a cord I'd brought from the electronics store. I put in the headphones and pressed play. At first, there was only the murmur of the party, the clinking of glasses. Then I heard the study door close. I heard voices, Mark's, Amelia's, and another man's I didn't recognize. They were laughing, celebrating, "A toast," Mark said, his voice thick with expensive scotch. "To a decade of success and to a future with no complications." Then Amelia's sharp voice cut through the air. "Did you see Catherine's work on that new will? Her mother's signature was a masterpiece. You'd never know it was forged." They all laughed. My world tilted on its axis. And then I heard the sound of the door opening again, and my daughter's voice, as cold and clear as a shard of glass, filled my ears. "Are they gone?" Catherine asked. "Good. Is it all finalized? The trust, the estate, everything?" "Everything, my love," Mark's voice oozed with satisfaction. "We have it all. It's for the best. She wouldn't know what to do with it anyway." "A mercy! Really?" A cold silence hung in the air, and then I heard my daughter speak the words that would forever sever the bond between us. "A mercy," Catherine repeated. "Now we can finally live our lives without having to look over our shoulders." I ripped the headphones from my ears, a silent scream trapped in my throat. This was it, the undeniable, soul-destroying proof. The love I had for my daughter, the fierce, unconditional love of a mother, finally, mercifully, died in that moment. And in its place, something terrible and strong was born. I sat there in the darkness, the damning recording playing softly on a loop. I reached into my cedar chest and pulled out the one thing they had left me: Arthur's letters. My hands found the last one he ever wrote me, dated a week before he passed. I unfolded the brittle paper, my eyes scanning the familiar, elegant script. And then I saw it. A final paragraph I had read 100 times, but never truly understood until now. "My dearest Alara," he had written, "the world can be a treacherous place. I have always tried to protect you, and I have tried to do so one last time. If the wolves ever come to the door, my love, do not look for our salvation in a vault or a bank. Look for the truth where our two hearts first met." For 3 days and 3 nights, I sat with my husband's last letter, the words blurring through a film of unshed tears. The recording of my daughter's betrayal was a serpent coiling in my gut. But Arthur's final words were a puzzle I had to solve. Where our two hearts first met, my mind, a frantic librarian, sifted through a lifetime of memories. Was it the little bench by the lake where he proposed? The small church where we were married? The hospital where Catherine was born? No, those were places of shared joy, but they were not the genesis. They were not the first place. My heart did not meet Arthur's on a park bench. It met his across a crowded, dusty, second-hand bookshop when I was just 19 years old. He was reading a book, and he looked up at me and smiled. The book. What was the book? And then, like a ray of sun piercing through a storm cloud, I remembered. He was holding a worn, leather-bound copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. A week later, he bought it for me. It was the first gift he ever gave me. My cedar chest, its lock broken and violated, sat at the foot of my bed. Inside, beneath the stacks of his letters, was that very book. I had carried it with me my entire life. My hands, now steady with purpose, lifted it out. It was heavy, the leather cover softened with age, the gold leaf of the title long since faded. It felt like holding a piece of my own soul. I ran my fingers over the cover, the spine, the thick, embossed edges. And that's when I felt it, a slight give. A seam along the inside of the back cover that was not quite flush. My breath caught. Using the edge of the small brass key from the chain around my neck, I pried at the seam. It gave way, revealing a hidden compartment cut with masterful precision into the thick cardboard of the cover. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, were 2 documents. The first was the one I had been desperately searching for. Arthur's original, notarized last will and testament, dated 1 month before his passing, its seal unbroken. The second document, however, was something else entirely, something I never knew existed. It was a share certificate. Dated 40 years ago, it represented a 51% controlling interest in a small, struggling construction firm called Cornerstone Builders. My dear, I did not know their plan was so flawed. A memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp and clear. Arthur coming home one evening, talking about a young friend of his, a carpenter with big dreams but no capital. Arthur, with his boundless faith in good people, had given the man his entire bonus that year, a sum of $5,000, not as a loan, but as an investment. "The boy has a good heart and a strong back, Alara," he'd said. "We're partners." I never heard another word about it. That young carpenter's name, printed on the certificate as the minority shareholder, was Franklin Thompson, Mark's father. Cornerstone Builders was the seed from which Mark's entire real estate empire, Thompson Global Properties, had grown. He had built his fortune on the foundation of my husband's quiet generosity, and he never even knew it. I was not a ghost in their house. I was the very ground on which it was built. The power I thought was lost was in my hands all along, a sleeping giant waiting for the command to wake. The game had changed. I was no longer a pawn in their cruel fantasy. I was the queen, and I was about to topple their entire board, but a queen needs her counsel. I couldn't do this alone. I thought of Arthur's oldest friend, Alistair Finch, a retired corporate lawyer who lived an hour down the coast. Alistair was a man of fierce integrity who had openly disliked Mark from the day he met him, calling him a hollow suit with a predator's smile. Using the burner phone I'd bought with the recorder, I called him. When he heard my voice, his tone was full of warmth and concern. I told him everything. I spared no detail. The deed, the power of attorney, the stolen pearls, the overheard conversations. I read him the contents of the forged will they had discussed on the recording. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Alistair finally spoke, his voice was no longer warm. It was glacial. "Alara," he said, the word a low growl of righteous fury. "I will be on your doorstep in 55 minutes. Do not speak to anyone. Do not open your door for anyone but me. We are going to bury them." When he arrived, I showed him the book, the will, and the share certificate. He held the certificate up to the light, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then he let out a low whistle. "My God, Arthur," he whispered to the empty air. "You magnificent, magnificent man." A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "Mark Thompson is about to have a very, very bad day." For the next 2 weeks, Alistair and I worked in secret. He operated from his home office, pulling records, verifying the unbroken chain of ownership from Cornerstone Builders to Thompson Global Properties. It was ironclad. My 51% stake was absolute. While he marshaled the legal forces, I continued my performance, playing the part of the fading matriarch. Mark and Catherine, drunk on their success and my apparent submission, grew careless. They left financial statements on the dining room table. They spoke openly of their plans, and their biggest plan of all was a massive, legacy-defining merger with an international conglomerate. The deal was to be announced at an emergency board meeting on September 22nd. Mark had called the meeting to secure his board's approval, a final rubber stamp on his ascent into the stratosphere of the financial world. Alistair and I had found our stage. It is often said that revenge is a dish best served cold, but I believe it is a dish best served in the bright, unforgiving light of public humiliation before an audience of one's peers. We made our preparations. The day before the meeting, I told Carol the nurse that I felt a deep sentimental urge to visit my old home one last time. It was a lie, of course, but it was the excuse I needed. She drove me into my old neighborhood, and while she waited in the car, I went not to my old house, but to a small, elegant boutique on the corner. I used the emergency credit card Alistair had arranged for me and bought a Chanel suit the color of ivory, a string of new pearls far more luminous than the ones they had stolen, and a pair of sensible, powerful heels. I was not just reclaiming my wealth, I was reclaiming myself. I never saw that terrible room again. The boardroom of Thompson Global Properties was on the top floor, a glass box in the sky overlooking the city. Mark stood at the head of a long granite table, his back to the door, addressing his board of directors. He was in his element, a king in his court, his voice booming with confidence as he outlined the glorious future of the company under the new merger. Catherine and Amelia sat in chairs against the wall, watching him with expressions of pure adoration. They were living their triumph. At precisely 10:15 a.m., just as Mark was reaching the crescendo of his speech, Alistair pushed open the heavy glass doors. And I walked in. Silence fell upon the room. Every head turned. Mark froze mid-sentence, his mouth agape. He stared at me as if he truly were seeing a ghost. I was not the stooped, frail creature from the guest house. I was Alara Gable, wife of Arthur Gable, and I had come to collect a debt. I walked slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking a steady, resolute rhythm on the polished floor. I did not look at my daughter. I did not look at her husband. I looked at the 10 board members sitting around the table as Alistair took his place beside me. "Mr. Thompson," Alistair's voice cut through the stunned silence, as sharp and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "Please continue. This shouldn't take long," Mark stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist. "Alistair? Ilara? What is the meaning of this?" "This is a private meeting." "It is," Alistair agreed smoothly. "A meeting of the board for its shareholders. And Mrs. Gable, as the majority shareholder, felt she should be in attendance." He placed a single, crisp document on the table. The share certificate. The color drained from Mark's face. Amelia let out a small gasp. Catherine looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Alistair then placed the small digital recorder on the table. "Before we discuss the merger," he said to the bewildered board, "there is a small matter of internal company ethics we need to address." He pressed play. The room filled with the sounds of a party, and then with the chilling, undeniable voices of Mark, Amelia and Catherine laughing about forgery, celebrating my financial ruin, and callously planning for my end. A masterpiece. You'd never know it was forged. A mercy, really. The board members stared, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust. Catherine buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent, humiliated sobs. Mark stood as if turned to stone, his empire crumbling to dust around him in the space of 30 seconds. When the recording finished, Alistair placed Arthur's true, notarized will beside the recorder. "And now," he said, his voice calm, "we can proceed with the business of the day." He looked at Mark, his eyes glinting with a cold, final fire. "But first, I believe there is a motion to be made." He turned to me. Every eye in the room was on me. I looked at Mark, at the man who had stolen my home, my security, and my daughter's soul. I looked at Catherine, the child I had raised, now a stranger weeping in shame. I felt no pity. I felt no rage. I felt only a vast, quiet emptiness where my love for them used to be. I rose to my feet, my voice clear and steady, echoing in the tomb-like silence of the room. "I, Ilara Gable, as the majority shareholder of this company, call for a vote of no confidence in the Chief Executive Officer, Mark Thompson, effective immediately." I didn't stay to watch the fallout. My work was done. Alistair handled the rest. The board, terrified and disgusted, voted unanimously to oust Mark. The merger was scuttled. An internal investigation was launched, which quickly uncovered years of financial fraud. Mark, Catherine, and Amelia were ruined, not just financially, but socially. Their names became whispers of scandal and disgrace in the circles they so desperately wanted to impress. The mansion was sold to cover the debts. They lost everything, because they had tried to take everything from a woman who had nothing left to lose. I did not keep the company. It was a monument to a greed that I wanted no part of. Alistair helped me liquidate my controlling shares, a fortune far greater than I could have ever imagined. With the proceeds, I paid back the original $5,000 my Arthur had invested, with interest, to a memorial fund for his young friend. Mark's father, a good man who deserved a better legacy than the son he had raised. The rest, I used to create the Arthur Gable Foundation, a charity that provides scholarships for underprivileged students and grants for small, honest businesses, the kind of people my husband always believed in. I bought a small house, not far from my old one. It has a little garden where I grow lavender, and the kitchen is always filled with the scent of baking bread. I have a new mug for my morning tea. It's a simple earthenware cup, and it has no cracks in it yet. Sometimes I sit by the window and think about all that happened. I think about how quickly love can curdle into cruelty, and how silence can be forged into a weapon. They thought my age made me weak, that my grief made me blind. They underestimated the power of a mother's memory and a wife's devotion. They tried to bury me, but they forgot that I was a seed. My dears, if you take one thing from this old woman's story, let it be this. Your dignity is a treasure that no one can steal unless you allow them to. It is not held in deeds or in bank accounts, but in the quiet strength of your own heart. Never let anyone, not even those you love most, make you feel invisible. Your story matters. Your truth has power. And if you have a story of your own, a time when you found your strength, when you thought all was lost, I would be so honored if you shared it in the comments below. Your voice is a light, and this world can always use a little more light. Thank you for listening. And please, Don't forget to subscribe. This old heart has many more truths yet to tell.